The memory of the Second World War hangs over Europe, an inescapable and irresistible point of reference. Historical parallels are usually misleading and dangerous. I was brought up in the war. I was an adolescent in the Second World War, and I did witness in London a great deal of the Blitz. When the Second World War finished, I was 23, and already I had seen enough horror to last me a lifetime. I'd seen dreadful things, without saying a word. So seeing horror depicted on film doesn't affect me much. As a Jew, I was taught that it was ethically imperative to speak up and to speak out against arbitrary state violence. That was part of what I learned when I learned about the Second World War and the concentration camps. Some of our best and unexpected discoveries have been born out of crises. From the Second World War, for example, came Alan Turing's decoding machine, widely considered as the precursor to modern-day computers and artificial intelligence. The Ukrainian nation, as no other nation, understands and is fully aware of the tragedy and its scale of all the lost lives of the Ukrainian Jews during the Second World War. Immigration has tremendously changed the fabric of this country. Immigration is what built our NHS, when Britain invited people from the Commonwealth, from nations it had formerly colonized, in order to rebuild this country after the ravages of the Second World War. I remember hearing the song when I was 12 or 14 it must have been in Chicago, 'cause we didn't have a radio on the farm, and it was during the Second World War. I had 3 brothers in that war who went overseas. Ukraine and Israel have long-standing historical ties. Our nations have together experienced all the tragedies in recent history, the Holodomor and the Holocaust, the Second World War, and the totalitarian Soviet regime. My folks were busy. My dad was a teacher, and it was during the Second World War, and my mother was working. So I got my stories from films and books. I read a lot, and I love to read to this day. 70 years after China emerged from the Second World War, the greatest threat facing the nation's leadership is not imperialism but skepticism. Since the end of the Second World War, our population has more than doubled to 27 million people. Born in 1936, I experienced the Second World War as a child in the city of Gelsenkirchen-Buer. This area was heavily bombed, but fortunately, all members of my family survived the war and post-war period. The generation which lived through the Second World War is disappearing. Post-war generations see Europe's great achievements, liberty, peace and prosperity, as a given. My dad had been in the Second World War, had electric shock treatment, suffered from anxiety and was abusive to my mom. I kept a lid on my feelings at school but, when I was 18, dropped out of everything and couldn't even be bothered to get out of bed. Let us not forget that the European community started as a project for peace after the terrible Second World War, and today people take for granted the freedom to travel, to study, to work abroad, and the citizens of one country have almost exactly the same rights as another country. When you write a 2,000-page history of the Second World War, the deportations and the concentration camps will take up 5 pages, and the gas chambers perhaps 20 lines. The horrors of the Second World War, the chilling winds of the Cold War and the crushing weight of the Iron Curtain are little more than fading memories. Ideals that once commanded great loyalty are now taken for granted. People talk often of Brexit as the biggest challenge since the Second World War. It is certainly proving to be a lot more difficult and complicated than was promised by those who won the referendum campaign in 2016. The EU is an organization that was created after the Second World War for calming down the nationalism of member states, and it did so very successfully. What has happened to architecture since the Second World War that the only passers-by who can contemplate it without pain are those equipped with a white stick and a dog? People that spend time in a foxhole, they're never going to find that relationship anywhere else again. Everything else pales next to that. When you think about the Second World War vets, more than even the Vietnam vets, there's a brotherhood. My accent does slip. When I arrived in England in 1978 at 18, I was shocked to find myself, the American, at RADA. The English and the Americans have an intense relationship. They helped us out in the Second World War. The First World War not only destroyed European civilization and the empires at its heart, its aftermath led to a second conflagration, the Second World War, which divided the continent until the end of the century. I think that perhaps the classic propagandists in the Second World War was Winston Churchill. He was extremely skilled and adept at it. In Finland, we learned quite a lot from our own civil war. The wounds were visible when I was a boy, but my generation went into the Second World War and it united the Finnish nation, so I do not see any more wounds. My dad was in the Second World War with General Patton. He won medals for bravery, but he came home quite damaged, so he was a handful. He told us some terrible stories, and I guess you'd say he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Education is the great growth industry of the Third World. Since the Second World War, we have multiplied the number of children in school by 4, with even larger multiples for secondary and university education. Warsaw's historic heart was deliberately almost entirely destroyed towards the end of the Second World War by the German occupying troops. After the war, it was painstakingly rebuilt, and that reconstruction is perceived as expressing the nation's determination to survive, to conserve its history and its culture. My parents had 3 kids right after the Second World War, and we were all sort of sickly. Then I had a 4th sibling, with very serious asthma. The medical bills. So my parents always struggled. Until the attack on Pearl Harbor, isolationism was an important, even dominant strand in U.S. politics. After the Second World War, this strand disappeared, smothered by the widespread and bipartisan conviction that the United States needed to stay engaged with the world to prevent future crises. The European wars of religion were more deadly than the First World War, proportionally speaking, and in the range of the Second World War in Europe. The Inquisition, the persecution of heretics and infidels and witches, they racked up pretty high death tolls. The great leaders of the Second World War alliance, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, understood the twin sides of destruction and salvation. Their war aims were not only to defeat fascism, but to create a world of shared prosperity. I acquired a hunger for fairy tales in the dark days of blackout and blitz in the Second World War. For an event that was wholly created in the poisonous psychological warfare kitchens of the Second World War, run by the ministries of propaganda in many countries, not just by the British or the Americans, but also the Russians and undoubtedly the world Jewish organizations. I am not saying that Hitler was a choir boy, but I am saying, let him who was innocent in the Second World War cast the first stone. If I had been Prime Minister, I would have offered apologies to the Dutch Jewish community without hesitation. This would refer both to our government's attitude during the Second World War and to the very late post-war discovery that the restitution process had been poorly conceived. I am not saying that during the Second World War Germany did not, under the leadership of the National Socialist government, commit crimes. These doomsday warriors look no more like soldiers than the soldiers of the Second World War looked like conquistadors. The more expert they become, the more they look like lab assistants in small colleges. What we want to do is reform the welfare system in the way that Tony Blair talked about 13 years ago but never achieved, a system that was created for the days after the Second World War. That prize is now, I think, achievable. It's my belief that, since the end of the Second World War, psychology has moved too far away from its original roots, which were to make the lives of all people more fulfilling and productive, and too much toward the important, but not all-important, area of curing mental illness. When my elders mentioned the war, they invariably meant that of 1914 to 1918, even after 1939, for the Second World War was merely the continuation of the first, an armistice of 20 years. As Marshal Foch had accurately predicted at the Versailles Peace Conference, with some changes of side. Human beings of today are more fragile, whereas people born in wartime, during the Second World War, eventually became the great players like Pelé. They were fantastic players. The Second World War claimed tens of millions of victims. For the record, I'm a Second World War veteran and served in the Pacific. Both of my grandfathers fought in the Second World War, and my great-grandfather died at the Somme in the First World War. I never truly believed that the war just finished and everyone was happy-clappy, brought out the bunting, and felt everything was okay again. That's definitely not my impression of the fallout of war. My mother had a son from previous marriage and her husband died in Second World War. My father fought behind Japanese lines in the Second World War and it traumatized him. Everybody who knew him from before said he was the life and soul of the party, fun to be with, but after the war he was different. I was born in the Second World War during the Nazi invasion of my country. Americans are not intrinsically imperial, but we ended up dominant by default. Europe disappeared after the Second World War, the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, so here we are. Visit our website for more quotes, Quoting.com